Hello and welcome to the National Center on Forensics community-focused webinar series. Today we will hear from Dr. Laura D. Knight, Chief Medical Examiner and Coroner at the Washoe County Regional Medical Examiner's Office, and Melanie Rouse, Coroner at the Clark County Office of the Coroner Medical Examiner, on transient workforce in forensic pathology, challenges, rewards, and best practices. Without further delay, I will turn things over to our presenters.
Well, hello from Nevada. We are pleased to be here to present for you today a roadmap for using contractual forensic pathologists or locum tenens in order to upstaff or provide coverage for your office's autopsy needs. On the next slide, we have a definition of locums. Locum tenens is a Latin term that refers to a substitute or a temporary provider of services, usually in the medical field. And this just refers to a physician working temporarily in the practice of another, often in medicine. In our field, in forensic pathology and death investigation, these are contract forensic pathologists who travel to an office to complete autopsies for a limited time for a fee, and they can be a useful workforce adjunct to meet our rising caseloads. And both my co-presenter, Coroner Rouse in Las Vegas, and I, located in Northern Nevada, utilize locum tenens contractors in our offices as part of our professional staff. The forensic pathologist workforce shortage is really now a well-known issue that's being addressed in the longer term with increased recruitment efforts and a lot of other strategic planning by our field's professional organizations, and that definitely includes the National Association of Medical Examiners. However, in the short term, administrators still have to find a way to get the work done while maintaining appropriate autopsy caseloads per forensic pathologist, whether that's for your accreditation purposes, just for quality purposes, or to retain your existing forensic pathology staff. We really have to keep down the number of autopsies per forensic pathologist, both for work-life balance and to meet accreditation standards and maintain quality. To really understand the scope of this problem, I think we have to look at the current state of the forensic pathology workforce. And according to data that was presented earlier this year by the National Association of Medical Examiners, the United States only has about 933 practicing board-certified forensic pathologists. And out of that, just over 900, only 791 of those are full-time. So 142 are part-time. We think that the number of forensic pathologists needed in the United States is probably about 1,500 full-time individuals, if not more, to deal with rising caseloads across every state. In November of 2022, the National Association of Medical Examiners had 55 job openings for forensic pathologists posted on its website. And compare that to November 2023, a year later, there are 53 forensic pathologist job openings. So unfortunately, there is more opportunity out there than forensic pathologists that we have currently. Only about 40 people become board certified every year by the American Board of Pathology in forensic pathology. It's a very small specialty, and we have a small number of fellowship training programs and a small number of people going into this field. The opioid epidemic is another major driver of the forensic pathologist shortage. Between fentanyl deaths and violent crimes that are associated with the opioid drug trade, forensic pathologists are really overloaded right now with rising caseloads. Finally, forensic pathologists are retiring at a faster rate than they are being replaced through the medical training pipeline. And there are really an insufficient number of training programs. And this is due to a number of factors: lack of funding, lack of institutional support, or even just enough recruitment efforts at the medical student level or even sooner to direct enough students into that pipeline leading to becoming a forensic pathologist. So the result is, as you see at the bottom of the slide here, that there are more locums contractors than ever. And that number I gave earlier, 142, part-time folks, those are locum tenens forensic pathologists. So about 15% of the current practicing forensic pathologists are part-timers, according to that NAME data.
I would just like to add that in addition to that, there are also many full-time practicing pathologists that also work part-time within other offices. So not only are they working within their own agency in a full-time capacity, they're also working part-time in other locations as well to help fulfill that shortage. I think we all recognize that the workload that we have as a whole entity is much greater than the number of physicians we have available to complete it. So without having that balance, I think there would be a significant decrease in the amount of information that can be collected from the deaths that we're tasked with investigating.
Thank you, Coroner Rouse. This next slide we have here really just summarizes for you staffing structures and some of the needs versus challenges that we have in death investigation systems. Some needs that we have are really strengthening that personnel pipeline all the way from education through recruitment, hiring, and then training and retaining these individuals, particularly, when these disciplines are facing critical personnel shortages. We really need systems-based collaborative training opportunities, including opportunities for collaboration and partnership between forensic service providers and universities on matching the curriculum to the employment needs and research and development needs of our field, as well as equipment sharing and training opportunities. Funding is always an issue with these initiatives, and we need funded, accessible, and available continuing education and professional development opportunities. And we need to be able to maintain certifications. It's particularly important for forensic pathologists to be board certified by the American Board of Pathology and to be able to testify as experts in court and not have their credentials questioned. This is really necessary. And finally, resources. We need more resources to address multiple issues in offices, but particularly one that has risen recently and we've become more aware of is workforce or workplace stress and vicarious trauma or secondary trauma associated with the forensic science work environment and the work that we do, the trauma that we see, and the terrible tragic circumstances that we observe daily. Coroner Rouse, I'd love to let you talk about some of the challenges.
So particularly, we are facing significant challenges when it comes to recruiting and retaining full-time forensic pathologists into the workforce. There is a significant delay between hiring and job readiness for all candidates. Even if qualified candidates can be identified and entered into an agreement to come on board as an employee, it can still take anywhere from 3 months to several years for that individual to become fully trained and proficient for their casework. I know we currently have some open job vacancies within our department, and it is my understanding that you are seeing more and more residents that are within their residency applying for full-time positions and being offered those positions before even completing their fellowship program. So this poses a significant challenge, because once you make that job offer, that position is sort of guaranteed to them. But what that means is that you're going to wait several months, and in some cases several years, for that individual to become a board certified forensic pathologist and to be ready to enter into the work environment as a fully functioning professional. So as the academic training does not necessarily match the needs or the preferences of that office, so then you also have the time that it takes to onboard them and get them set up within your state's infrastructure. So knowing the statutes that they have to operate under and the changes and challenges that are particular to that location. Also, there can be significant delays in obtaining their medical license within the state that they've been hired into. Another challenge is funding. Funding for training is typically much lower than what is actually required for that operation to happen. There's a lack of funding often for training, certification, continuing of education that's required for these personnel, and also of maintaining your accreditation standards. In addition to that, we have retention challenges. Retention is particularly challenging right now because of the amount of student loan debt that comes with the amount of education that's required of these professionals. Specifically, in areas where there is shortages, these candidates may leave your agency to go somewhere else where they can engage in paying off their student debt faster. I would say that the background investigation is also challenging. So, completing a background investigation for your applicants often takes months while we wait for criminal backgrounds to be completed, their medical backgrounds and certifications to be completed. And this in itself can be a challenge to the agencies. I would also say the available resources that are there for law enforcement, fire departments, and other industries to address some of the stress and vicarious trauma these professionals face are still significantly lacking in the forensic sciences. So I think we need to boast those things to help increase our workforce. But in order for us to still complete the missions and tasks that we're responsible of doing, our offices rely greatly on having locums.
Yes, and I would just stress again, you touched on this, Coroner Rouse, the lead time to hire a forensic pathologist is extremely long currently. It's typical if you have a job opening, that it may be open 1 to 2 years prior to filling, which, a decade ago was not the case at all. And all of my recent hires in my office were very long lead times, and I've even had, as you alluded to interview people who were still in their training, and it's really challenging because it's difficult to check references or to talk about their work product with a reference when they haven't made any work product yet, really. So these are challenging recruitments, and so that's part of the reason that locums may be helpful. And that segues into our next slide here, talking about different practice structures or business models for using locums in your office. Really, different business models can be applied. These contractors could be used for a limited time if you have a vacancy or even someone on an extended leave, in the either in the academic setting where they're taking a 6-month sabbatical or research term, or even someone who's on an extended medical or mental health leave. These locum tenens can fill in those shorter term vacancies. They also, though, could be used in an office indefinitely as part of the routine caseload coverage for an office, because there are some budgetary advantages to using locum tenens who are not fully benefited employees who don't have the additional cost of benefits. They also could be used, and my office has done this, to cover an increasing caseload when you have periods of rapid caseload growth. But of course, your budget process lags behind that. And so the time it takes to get an additional forensic pathologist position approved in a county or state government scenario could be a year to 18 months with your within your budget process. And so you may have to use locum tenens as kind of a stopgap measure to handle the excess caseload while you seek the approval in budget to hire another full-time employee. And then along with that, the recruitment lead time to recruit that full-time forensic pathologist once you have them approved. There are some pros and cons, certainly, to these different practice structures, the permanent versus temporary particularly. And there are some pros and cons to having an office entirely staffed by locums versus having some full-time forensic pathologists and some locums. So I'll start with the concept of all locums versus some locums. So the pros of having all locum staffing would be very flexible staffing, flexible scheduling, the possibility of reduced costs because you don't have to pay these individuals benefits such as insurance and retirement. But there are quite a few cons to that arrangement. One is lack of stability over time because contractors will come and go. There may be a lack of consistency in your work product, your autopsy reports, because you have different individuals who have trained and practiced in different offices all over the U.S. coming to do work in your office. There may not be consistency there. There's no forensic pathologist in charge or to oversee them. And then finally, if you have all locums contractors, you would need to bring them back to testify, which is going to be an additional cost to your whatever your government structure is, county or state, to your district attorney's office, your prosecuting attorneys, because they're going to have to bring back these experts to testify in homicide cases and other kinds of cases. The permanent use of locums, meaning that they are part of your office's practice plan, versus using them only during periods of short staffing or high caseload, is another possible decision point here that we can talk about. In my office, we have used locums generally as a stopgap measure. And so we have used them when caseload has risen, but not enough to justify another full-time employee. So they might cover, say, a half of a forensic pathologist caseload per year. We've also used them when we had vacancies, when someone relocated to another office. And so we used them to cover that vacancy while recruiting. And we've used them to cover periods when more than one of our doctors wanted to go to a particular conference and was going to be out of the office, and we need that coverage. And so that's how we've used them in our office. I would invite Coroner Rouse to talk about how her office uses locums, because they use them in a more permanent fashion.
So yes, our office does use locums as part of our permanent scheduling. We have them consistently on rotation, rotating through our office, working anywhere from 3 to 5 days at a time. In those stretches, we use those typically to give our full-time staff paper days so that they can close out their casework. It also gives them days to complete testimony and also to attend conferences like Dr. Knight had mentioned. I would also like to comment that in addition to some of the challenges with having to bring locums back for testimony, one of the things that also has to be built into their contractual agreement is whether or not they will take those complex cases. So you will have some part-time pathologists that are no longer wanting to take these more complex cases, or cases that will require them return to that state for testimony down the road. So often that does require reaching out and making negotiations with your district attorney's offices to make sure that they can allow things like remote testimony, and having those things kind of aligned prior to bringing them on service permanently as part of your structure. Since we use them permanently as staff in our office, we have some that will take complex cases and some that will not. So we always have to make sure that one of our full-time pathologists is available to take that homicide in the event that that comes in during the time that we're scheduled with our locums.
Thank you. And similarly, we also have a backup forensic pathologist, a full-time medical examiner from our office, who is on call every time a locum tenens is here covering the office for that very reason. We don't have our locums do homicide cases because we want to keep those local and keep our medical examiners as the ones who are going to be testifying on those. And I believe that has helped us in our recruitment of locums, because they do prefer to not have to do those cases and return to testify. I think we're ready to move on to requirements for your local agency. This is something to consider. What kind of contracts are you going to have? What will be required of locums who come to work for you? And so some of the things to consider are medical licensure. Of course, they will have to be medically licensed in your state. There may be the possibility of interstate compacts or multi-state licensure that may make that process easier. Here in Nevada, to my knowledge, we don't recognize any interstate compacts, unfortunately. So everyone who does come to work here does have to get specifically a Nevada license, but you'll have to look into that specific to your state. You'll also have to review and have them submit their board certification to the office from the American Board of Pathology. We also require that our contractors have their own insurance. This is liability insurance, sometimes referred to as malpractice insurance, but in the pathology realm, it is liability and errors and omission insurance typically. Have to consider your timeline as well. From the time of offering them a locum position to hiring, and whether you need to do a background investigation as a requirement of your agency. And then continuing education and monitoring whether they have kept up their board certification requirements. Continuous certification is something else that you may need to do, as well as to consider practicing by standards. And I'll ask Coroner Rouse if she has more to say about that.
Yeah, so it's vitally important that you do at least annually checks to make sure that licenses are up to date and not expired. You also want to make sure that they are still meeting all of their continuing education that is required for their certifications. So you need to frequently ask for the recertifications to be submitted. You must keep track of them. In our office, if we have anywhere from 10 to 15 locum tenens on rotation at any given time. So making sure that you have somebody that is consistently monitoring those things to make sure that they're maintaining their credentials is incredibly important. I would also say making sure that they're also practicing the standards that are important to your organization. So with that being said, within your accreditation, you have certain turnaround times that you must meet. You have specific requirements for the investigation itself as far as using contractual specialties and things of that nature. So you need to make sure that anybody that you bring on service with you is maintaining those standards, maintaining their credentials, maintaining their continuing education, and maintaining the requirements of your agency.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about recruitment and compensation, and these definitely go hand in hand. How to recruit locum tenens is essentially to create an advertisement, which should most certainly include the details of compensation, because that's going to be the first question they're going to ask, and creating that advertisement will allow you then to post it to national organizations, national professional organizations that have job boards online. And these would include the National Association of Medical Examiners, the International Association of Coroners and Medical Examiners, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, for example, as well as your local county or state government websites where you normally would post jobs. You definitely want to compare your compensation structure to other offices that are in your state or your region to ensure that you're competitive and that you're offering a fair rate and a fair workload compared to those other offices, or you will have difficulty recruiting individuals who are interested in accepting the compensation. The compensation structures, there's various ways that you can do it. You can compensate the pathologist per case that they perform. You could also decide to compensate them per day that they cover at your office, as well as compensating for autopsies and other examinations. You could also consider compensating other tasks within your office. And so typically, if you are compensating per case, there are different kinds of cases, of course, that are going to have different fees, whether it's a full autopsy, an external examination, some sort of limited autopsy if your office does, for example, head-only autopsies, as well as paper case reviews where the medical examiner or coroner is taking jurisdiction of the case, but is not performing an autopsy. That structure, and with the per case compensation, has the advantage that the forensic pathologist is being compensated for the work that they do per the case, and they then will be willing to do multiple cases most likely. If you compensate them per day, You typically will have a limit on how many cases you expect the forensic pathologist to handle of particular types per day, or the complexity of cases that will be handled. And so often offices that compensate per day will have a different rate for a forensic pathologist who will take all types of cases, including complex cases like baby deaths or homicides, versus maybe a lower rate if they're only doing routine cases like natural deaths and overdoses. If you pay per day, you can consider paying an additional administration or paperwork day for timely report completion, and tie that to turnaround time by requiring that those reports be completed by within the name accreditation standards of 60 days in order to earn that bonus pay. And that's a way to incentivize a good turnaround time. You may want to consider if there are other tasks that your office needs to outsource and what the compensation would be for those. If you have any backlogs, if you have forensic pathologists who left the office and left a significant open case backlog, perhaps you would want to compensate a forensic pathologist to finalize those cases. You could also have them reviewing cold cases, working on old identification cases that are unsolved or cold cases that have been brought up by your local law enforcement cold case teams. They could also participate in fatality review teams on behalf of the office, provide QA services, update and review policies, even in preparation for accreditation, if those are services that you need. So those are other creative ways to use locum tenens forensic pathologists. For the most part, most locum tenens just do autopsies. Another consideration is the budget that you're going to need for all of this. So when you're creating your compensation structure, you have to consider how many cases do I need the locum tenens to do and how much money do I have to pay for that? And you need to try to make those numbers match. If you're short one forensic pathologist, so you know you need 250 autopsy equivalents covered, calculate how much that will cost in your compensation plan, and include any other costs such as travel if you're planning to reimburse those, and ensure basically that you have sufficient budget. Coroner Rouse, I know you have a different compensation structure than we do. We compensate by the case, and we incentivize then our forensic pathologists taking the cases, but you compensate for the day. But I'd love to hear your take on that.
So yes, our compensation structure is based on a per day caseload. So we do assign them cases for that day. In addition to that, we also do provide some additional compensation for taking those complex cases. We then provide admin time. So time for them to close their cases out, which is calculated at a rate of six cases or 6 autopsy equivalents being closed. They do get admin time paid for that for their compensation structure. I think one thing as a whole medical legal death investigative system that we should always be cautious of is that we're not constantly overstacking one another to recruit these professionals, because I think that will budgetarily lead to significant deficits within the forensic sciences as a whole. So I think Dr. Knight hit on a very key point about making sure that we are making sure that we are competitive with our partners, but not making sure that we're also not overstepping to the point where we are going to limit the ability for anybody to have these professionals, because we know it has to create a balancing act.
Great, thank you for that. So travel and other costs are variable by location. Some of the locum tenens advertisements I've seen did not include travel, and you just have to consider where your locums are going to be coming from. If you are in a geographic region where you think that they will be driving, for example, if you're in the New England area and there are many forensic pathologists, they're thick on the ground, and you know that they're probably going to be driving and they're not going to be traveling from far away, that might be something that you would not reimburse because they're just going to drive in, and travel is not a big expense. If you are in Nevada, where we don't have a lot of forensic pathologists and we have a very large state, you might have to consider covering travel and per diem costs, because these forensic pathologists are going to be coming from potentially all over the United States. And we do have some of ours have come all the way from the East Coast. So I believe that both of our offices do reimburse locums for flights and travel. travel, ground transportation, lodging, and per diem. The benefit of that, of course, is that locum tenens are willing to come to our offices from farther away, and they may preferentially schedule with offices that do cover these expenses. But there are challenges to this as well. And Coroner Rouse, I know that you have some challenges with the rates of reimbursement there in Vegas. Is that right?
That is correct. One of the challenges that we face here in Las Vegas is that anytime that there is a large scale event, I think a lot of people are very aware right now, we are getting ready to host the F1 race. So, what that means is that you will find that hotel rates will increase, flight costs will increase, often exceeding what the standard government rate is. So, you have to be able to make those justifications to still bring these professionals in because your office still needs the coverage and you still need to make sure that cases are being examined timely. And often that requires going to your government officials to explain why you are reimbursing people for hotel costs and things like that that may exceed what that standard is. So you need to be very cautious of that. I would also say, in addition to that, if you are bringing in these professionals that are willing to take those complex cases, you may also have to consider how you're going to go about reimbursing them for the time that they spend doing things like courtroom testimony, how you're going to go about returning them to your jurisdiction for that time period if they do have to testify. And so thinking about how you're going to make this compensation happen, whether it's making negotiations with your DA's office to handle that, or there's some kind of reimbursement channel, I think those things are very important to have ironed out before you bring these professionals on and start assigning them some of these homicides and infant deaths and cases where there may be criminal charges.
Very important, yes, to have that hammered out in advance, and that could even be an incentive, again, for recruitment. That if an individual knows that you already have that in place and they know how it's going to be handled, they're probably more likely to come and work in a jurisdiction that has that ironed out. Versus, I know I've heard from other forensic pathologists that they've turned down opportunities for locums work because they were told basically do the homicides and then you figure it out with the DA how that's going to work when you come back to testify, and that's a big unknown, and no one wants to be dealing with that. So I think it's a great point to have that hammered out if you're going to be having them do the homicides. As far as scheduling for forensic pathologists that work on a contract basis is likely going to be months in advance because they are highly sought after. It is competitive. And there will be key periods of time, such as our couple of big conferences each year that are going to be highly sought after. So you're going to want to ask about those well in advance if you think that you need that coverage. And then any anticipated leaves, if you know that you have every forensic pathologist in your office has school-age children and would like to have spring break or part of it off, you might want to ask for the spring break weeks in advance. And then you want to really have one person in your office manage scheduling so that the locum tenens are not emailing with multiple people in the office about schedules. You really want to have one person handle that. I handle that in my office personally because I feel it's important to treat my professional colleagues with respect and to make sure that that's all handled very well. But any administrative person in your office can be responsible for that. And there just needs to be clear communication, and you need to send reminders to the forensic pathologist about when you're anticipating their first day and last day of service will be.
In addition to the scheduling component, I think it's also important to make sure that you have backup plans as to what you will do, because emergencies do happen. It is not uncommon that someone may have a delayed flight or something may come up that causes them to be unable to travel. So make sure that when you're looking at your scheduling, you're working through what those logistic challenges that can arise may look like. So that way you do not find yourself in a pitfall of not having them present to complete the work that's required.
That's a great point. So wrapping up, we're getting close to the end here. Just want to talk a little bit about day-to-day operations. You really want to know what autopsy cases will be assigned to the locum tenens and how you will break up cases. Are they going to take all cases? Are they going to take just the non-homicide routine cases, only a certain number of autopsies? That all needs to be determined in advance. Locum tenens can handle all the cases for an office during their scheduled work period, potentially, or a set number of cases, or only those cases that don't mean they're going to have to return to testify. It just depends on the size of your operation and how you determine that you want to handle it. For example, in Las Vegas, you probably don't have a locum tenens covering all the office cases for the day, because that could be 20 cases. In a smaller office like mine, they may be able to cover most of the cases and have just a backup overflow forensic pathologist to take a couple of cases if they don't want to complete that number of cases, or it's not reasonable for them to. And again, work out an agreement or plan if they will be returning to testify. You do want to consider who is going to determine the level of examination in a case, particularly if your locum tenens are compensated per case. It could be a perceived conflict of interest for them to determine which cases require an autopsy. So you may want to have a backup medical examiner from full-time medical examiner from your office to be assigned to review cases and to make those determinations on the locum's coverage days and to handle any overflow cases. And the reason I say this is because there could be the allegation that someone chose to do autopsies on cases that didn't really require an autopsy because they knew that they would be compensated, or maybe there weren't enough autopsies that day and they wanted to add on one more, or the opposite. There were too many cases, and so they might choose not to autopsy something that normally in your office, by your practice standards, would be autopsied. And so it's important to have someone in your office that is making those determinations, particularly if the physician is being compensated by the case. And then we've mentioned about the criminal charges and need for later testimony. And then other professional tasks may be assigned to the locums, and we've talked about that a little bit already, but have them here lined out for you: backlog elimination, report completion, and maybe even quality assurance reviews. And so just considering how those will be assigned and what quantity and how you'll handle that. Anything to add on that, Coroner Rouse?
I think that's a good pathway into the management and QA, QI. So you want to make sure that you are consistently reviewing the work that's being completed by the locum tenens. So how you need to have it ironed out within your agency on how cases are going to be reviewed. Who's going to be reviewing those cases? In our office, we have our full-time forensic pathologists that do review and sign off on cases when they become unpended or when they're at the time of case closure. You want to make sure that you're also preparing them during the onboarding processes through having a workflow and job aids that are available to them to kind of get them adequate to your system. Make sure you're prepared for them to show up. You can't just expect them to spend their full day in the autopsy suite. You need to make sure that you have office space and resources available to them so that they have a place to go to dictate their cases once they've finished their exams, or take their notes if that's the way they prefer to do that. You also have to figure out access parameters, how you're going to get them access to your database to review things like photographs and investigative reports and information that may be pertinent to that case. You also have to design how the communication will take place once they have completed the examinations and they're ready to submit their cases after case closure. I know Dr. Knight touched a bit on the scheduling aspects of things and why it's important to look at those things. I personally look at our caseload trends as well, so that when we're making determinations on when we are needing more locum tenens to be on board, and you may have more than one or two scheduled at a time, looking at those trends can be incredibly important to identify those scheduling needs. Also making sure that you're adhering to your accreditation standards. So making sure that you're reviewing their volume to make sure that it fits within what the name accreditation standards are for the number of autopsies that any forensic pathologist can handle. And also making sure that they're aware of those limitations and that they're aware of the policies and procedures and the safety requirements of your agency. And then make sure that they have access to those things as well. So anything you want to add to that, Dr. Knight?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on about the accreditation caseload requirements that has been debated, and of course, the National Association of Medical Examiners accreditation is what we're talking about here. That any forensic pathologist is not performing more than 250 autopsies or 325 for a phase 2 violation. That is in an individual office. That's what NAME's interpretation of that has been so far. So you do not have to find out how many autopsies they're doing at all the different offices they work at, but certainly you don't want to have them doing more than that number of cases at your office. And something that we have done just to help with workflow is to create workflow documents and job aids in our office to help these individuals assimilate into our office and understand how our workflow works. They use our dictation templates for their reports so that we have consistent reporting, et cetera. And so we really try to guide them and manage them actively so that they're not just kind of thrown to the wolves in a new practice setting. And then I think on the next slide, Coroner Rouse, we have a slide from your office showing how you track trends.
So this is actually tracking volume by months. So if you look consistently year over year, you can see that our office consistently has a spike during our summer months. And trying to get forensic pathologists to want to come to Las Vegas in the midst of the heat can sometimes be difficult, but you can see that is a great need for our office. So as we are preparing to head into those months, we do try to get scheduling ironed out so that we know that when we're hitting that peak volume, we have those professionals available to handle the examinations that are coming in.
Great. I think that's a great plan. So, while there are a lot of considerations and challenges to using locums, the rewards to using locums to expand capacity are really vast. We are able to increase our autopsy caseload capacity while reducing the risk of burnout for full-time staff. We are able to improve autopsy report turnaround time in cases that are in offices that are overloaded. It may help you to maintain or achieve office accreditation. You may be able to eliminate any existing open report backlogs if needed. This will help to retain current full-time forensic pathologists if you do have an overload of cases, as you can improve their work-life balance. And finally, this may enhance your ability to recruit future full-time forensic pathologists because they know that you're willing to use locum tenens for flexible workload capacity so that they will not be overworked in the future. Thank you all for your attention, and I think that's all we have today.
Thank you all. Hello, my name is Danielle Jackson, and I am with the American Society for Clinical Pathology. Thank you both for providing an informative presentation. We will now begin our Q&A session. As a reminder, we will only be answering pre-submitted questions today, and thank you to those who have submitted those questions ahead of time. So the first question that we have is, how do you vet those professional candidates?
Well, we're a small specialty forensic pathology, so I would say the most important piece, in addition to the licensure, board certification, et cetera, that we already described in the presentation, the most important piece is to check references, to talk with other chief medical examiners who've employed them in the past or other forensic pathologists they have worked with. I would say references are very important in that. How about you, Coroner Rouse?
I would also say that it's important to review samples of their work. So asking them to submit copies or examples of their autopsy reports on various different caseloads. So a natural death, a homicide, and an infant case are pretty standard reports that we would request from them when they apply. And review those ahead of time to have those reviewed by a full-time medical examiner that works within your agency. I think that's another great point to start with. So that way you have at least an idea of what their work product will look like.
Thank you. The second question we have is, how do you handle situations in which the contractor's determinations are at odds with standard practices in the office? For example, particular cases of death wordings that may have been rejected by your local vital statistics.
Well, we really handle these via, a collegial conversation, talking about, why we do what we do in our office, and particularly when it's a cause of death wording that we know may be used in another jurisdiction, but is not accepted by our vital statistics, we're usually just able to explain that on a colleague-to-colleague level, and it's well accepted and understood, and the report will be altered to fit those requirements. But really, to prevent that up front, we here locally have our local style guide, which is a document of guidelines regarding common case types and how we choose to word the cause of death. This is, of course, not asking a forensic pathologist to change substantially what their cause of death is, but literally just the choice of words to express that same cause of death, so that it is in line with our typical practices.
I would say, in addition to that, we also have them participate in our QA sessions. So in our case closure sessions every day, we have them sit in and listen to our full-time forensic pathologists and how they are wording their death certification pieces. It kind of gives them that hand-on-hand training, and also that gets back to the QA and QI that has to take place for these professionals.
Our next question, if you reimburse travel, do you require contractors to commit to working a certain number of days or weeks?
We do. We typically require them to work 4 days at minimum in a row if we are paying for cross-country travel. If they're local, though, however, if they're just driving here, they could cover single days. Coroner Rouse, how about?
So we typically have them work anywhere from 3 to 5 days. So again, based on the needs of our office and how we use them in more of a full-time capacity, we have them commit to those days.
That leads me to my next question. What is the recruiting process?
Well, we create a flyer that specifies the needs of the office, the requirements for them to be eligible to take the position, and the compensation that they'll receive, and again, post that to our national professional organizations job sites, as well as our local government job openings site.
And we have a very similar practice here where we have a flyer that we do post to various different professional organizations. And we also rely heavily on word of mouth. So that word of mouth of different locums that are already working for our agency, they often come across other professionals that are interested into either becoming a locum tenens, or they are actively practicing as one and they're looking to expand their locations that they currently travel to.
And there are also headhunters and staffing firms that supply locums that you could utilize as well. We haven't ventured into that because we've had enough candidates otherwise, but there are staffing groups that provide forensic pathologist locum tenens as well.
And how do you handle those background checks and the verifications of those credentials?
Well, in our office, we have an administrative professional that is assigned to this, that covers all of this, and we verify the licensure, the medical licensure with the state. We verify board certification with the American Board of Pathology, and we require copies of all diplomas, licenses, insurance, et cetera, to be submitted with the application process. We do not require at this time a formal background check of these professionals. Once they've submitted all these credentials and we've checked references, we consider that sufficient. How about you, Coroner Rouse? What do you do?
So we do have a purchasing and contracts division that does go through the entire contractual requirements for Clark County, including their business licenses, their medical license verification. And then, like I said, we do verify those things on an annual basis as well. We do require a criminal background check. So upon their first day, we actually had to get a waiver from our county to allow these professionals to start, because many of them may not travel to your location until their start date. And this is after they've already gotten their medical license. They've already been verified for all of their contractual responsibilities and their insurance information. So we get a pre-start to background signed off by one of our assistant county managers. And that allows us to have them come on board and get fingerprinted that first day. And then once those fingerprints are completed, then they will get access to our computer systems and things like that.
And I'll just add, I misspoke. We do a basic background check with fingerprinting. We have a couple of different levels of the extent of background check. So we do a basic background check on these individuals.
Thank you. And my last question, how do you onboard these professionals?
We'll let Coroner Rouse go first since I've answered first on every other question.
So the onboarding processes, they will typically come in and be assigned to one of our full-time forensic pathologists to work with them through the day to make sure that they get onboarded throughout the system. We also would allow them opportunity to have access to our section managers to help them make sure that they have the tools and the stuff they need from our forensics division. We would give them access to our chief investigator in case they need any information from investigations so that they know the channels of reaching out and where they can ask questions. And we also provide them with obviously a tour of our facility. We get them set up for where they're going to be when they're not in exams, and we kind of handle that as their onboarding process. It's a lot of hand holding.
And I would agree. Same here. We have a checklist of items that we require from them, and then a checklist of items that we provide to them. All the way from access badges and computer logins and email access to instructions on how to use our computer system, how to look at X-rays, the workflow documents that I mentioned previously, the job aids that help them to know where files go in our office from person to person, et cetera, the report templates to help them to make their autopsy reports in our format. And then we also will definitely meet with them the first day, and a lot of hand holding, as you say, to make sure that they understand how our system works and how they're going to do their work here to the same quality that our full-time individuals do.
Well, thank you so much. And with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Please feel free to contact our presenters for additional information. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you for our presenters for being here today.
As you depart, we kindly ask that you take a minute or two to complete our post-event questionnaire. The link will be pasted in the chat and also appear as you exit the Zoom room. Your feedback helps us improve our outreach efforts and continue to provide the best experience possible. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.